I never thought much about food security until the day I stood in an empty grocery store aisle during a supply chain disruption. Shelves that were usually packed with colorful packages now showed bare metal and cardboard. People around me looked confused, almost panicked, reaching for whatever remained. That's when it hit me. We've built our entire lives around a system that could stop working at any moment. I started asking myself uncomfortable questions. What would actually happen if trucks stopped delivering for a week, 2 weeks, a month? I looked at my own pantry and realized everything there had expiration dates measured in days or weeks, not months or years. Fresh produce, dairy, frozen meals, bread that molds within a week. Our modern food system is designed for constant movement, constant replenishment, constant dependency. That realization changed something in me. I became obsessed with a simple question: what foods would actually keep people alive if stores stopped restocking? Not for a day or two, but for real stretches of time when normal supply chains failed. I began researching how people survived before refrigerated trucks, before global supply networks, before the entire infrastructure we take for granted. I dove into historical accounts of families weathering harsh winters, explorers crossing continents, soldiers enduring long campaigns, isolated communities managing months without resupply. What I found was a completely different food philosophy, one built on resilience rather than convenience. These people didn't worry about expiration dates the way we do. They created foods designed to last through seasons, through crises, through uncertainty. They understood something we've forgotten. True food security doesn't come from having access to a store. It comes from having knowledge and preparation. The more I researched, the more I realized there was an entire category of emergency foods that have been quietly pushed aside by modern commerce. These weren't survival gimmicks or expensive freeze-dried meals in shiny packages. They were simple, proven staples that ordinary people relied on for centuries. I started with the basics. Grains, not the processed flour we buy in paper bags, but whole grains like wheat berries, rice, oats, and barley stored properly. When kept in airtight containers away from moisture and pests, these grains can last 20 to 30 years. 30 years. Think about that. A single purchase could outlast most of the appliances in your kitchen. Our ancestors understood this. Farm families kept grain storage as their foundation of security. They knew that as long as they had grain, they had bread, porridge, and the ability to stretch other foods further. It wasn't exciting food, but it was reliable food, the kind that kept families alive when crops failed or money ran out. Then I discovered dried legumes, beans, lentils, split peas, chickpeas. When stored correctly, these protein-rich foods can last indefinitely. I found accounts of beans stored for over 30 years that still cooked up perfectly fine. They were the protein source for people who couldn't afford meat regularly or couldn't keep it fresh. A bag of dried beans represented months of meals, not days. What struck me was how simple the preservation method was. Just keep them dry. No fancy equipment, no chemical preservatives, no refrigeration. The food itself was designed by nature to last, and humans simply learned to store it properly. But the real revelation came when I learned about pemmican. I'd never heard of it before, and I suspect most people haven't. Pemmican was a concentrated survival food created by indigenous peoples of North America, later adopted by fur traders and Arctic explorers. It's made from dried meat pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat, and sometimes dried berries. The nutritional density is incredible. High protein, high fat, compact, and when properly made, it can last for years, even decades, without refrigeration. Explorers crossing polar regions carried pemmican because it provided maximum nutrition in minimum space and weight. It was specifically engineered for survival. I tried making some myself, following traditional methods. The process taught me something important. These foods required effort and knowledge to produce, but once made, they asked almost nothing of you. No energy for refrigeration, no worry about spoilage, no constant replacement. The work was front-loaded. The security was long-term. For those who want to go deeper into natural self-reliance, we left a guide in the first link in the description showing the best medicinal plants you can grow in your backyard, because I realized this knowledge about food resilience connects directly to broader self-sufficiency. I kept digging. I learned about hardtack, the legendary survival biscuit that fed sailors and soldiers for centuries. It's just flour, water, and salt, baked until completely dry. It's hard enough to break teeth if you're not careful, but it lasts virtually forever. Civil War hardtack has been found still edible over 150 years later. Nobody would call hardtack delicious, but that misses the point entirely. It was never about taste. It was about not starving when everything else ran out. When I held a piece of hardtack I'd made, I understood. This represented insurance. This represented the difference between dependence and resilience. Salted and cured meats were another revelation. Before refrigeration, salt was the primary method of preserving protein. Salt pork, salt beef, bacon cured and smoked properly, dried fish, jerky. These weren't delicacies. They were necessities. Families would cure meat in the fall and rely on it through winter and spring. Done correctly, These preserved meats could last months to over a year. The method works because salt draws out moisture and creates an environment where bacteria can't thrive. Smoking adds another layer of preservation through dehydration and antimicrobial compounds in the smoke. These weren't accidental discoveries. They were refined over generations into reliable techniques. Then, there's honey. I was amazed to learn that honey essentially never spoils. Archaeologists have found pots of honey in ancient Egyptian tombs, thousands of years old, still perfectly edible. Honey's low moisture content and acidic pH make it naturally antimicrobial. It's not just a sweetener, it's a preservable source of quick energy that requires zero processing to store safely. I started seeing a pattern. Every emergency food I researched shared common traits: low moisture content, natural preservation mechanisms, nutrient density, and proven longevity. These weren't modern inventions or marketing gimmicks. They were time-tested solutions developed when failure meant hunger. Fermented foods opened another door. Sauerkraut, kimchi, pickles, fermented vegetables. The fermentation process not only preserves the food, but actually increases its nutritional value and digestibility. Traditional fermentation creates an acidic environment that prevents spoilage while cultivating beneficial bacteria. Families kept crocks of fermented vegetables in root cellars, providing vitamins and probiotics through long winters, when fresh produce was impossible to obtain. The knowledge of fermentation was passed down because it worked, generation after generation. Root cellaring itself fascinated me. Before refrigeration, people stored cold hardy vegetables like potatoes, carrots, onions, turnips, beets, and cabbage in underground cellars where cool, humid conditions prevented spoilage for months. Some vegetables would last from fall harvest through early spring. The technology was literally just a hole in the ground, properly ventilated. I visited an old farmhouse with an intact root cellar. Standing in that cool earth-scented space, I felt connected to a practical wisdom we've nearly lost. These people understood their environment and worked with it. They didn't need electricity or complex systems. They needed knowledge and a bit of planning. Dried fruits and vegetables were everywhere in historical accounts. Apples sliced and dried, berries sun-dried or smoked, corn dried and stored, peppers strung and hung. Removing moisture meant removing what bacteria and mold need to grow. The process was simple: slice thin, expose to dry heat or sun, store away from moisture. The result? Months or even years of storage life. I experimented with drying my own vegetables. It was time-consuming, but not difficult. What surprised me was how much food reduced in volume. Pounds of fresh produce became cups of dried food, concentrated nutrition in compact form. I began to see why travelers, traders, and armies relied on dried foods. They could carry weeks of calories in a single pack. Powdered milk was another staple I'd overlooked. Properly stored powdered milk can last years, providing a dairy source when fresh milk would spoil in hours. It's been a cornerstone of emergency food storage for militaries and aid organizations precisely because it delivers nutrition without refrigeration or constant supply. If learning about these long-lasting foods opened your eyes, check the first link in the description. We placed a guide showing medicinal plants you can grow at home to build even more self-sufficiency, because food resilience and health independence are part of the same philosophy. As my research deepened, I started to see the bigger picture. Our modern food system is incredibly efficient at delivering variety and convenience, but it's built on fragility. We've traded resilience for speed, durability for freshness, self-reliance for dependency on complex networks. The average grocery store keeps only about 3 days of inventory. Distribution centers operate on just-in-time delivery. If transportation stops, if fuel runs short, if any link in that chain breaks, those shelves empty fast. And most of what we buy wouldn't last a week, even if we could stockpile it. Contrast that with historical food systems. Farm families kept grain for a year or more. They had crocks of fermented vegetables, barrels of salted meat, bins of root vegetables, strings of dried produce. They weren't paranoid, they were practical. They knew uncertainty was normal, not exceptional. I'm not romanticizing the past. Life was harder in many ways, but in terms of food security, they had something we lack: genuine resilience at the household level. They could weather disruptions that would devastate us today. What struck me most was how this knowledge has been nearly erased in just 2 or 3 generations. My grandparents' generation knew how to can, cure, ferment, and store food. My parents' generation used some of those skills. My generation, we know how to use refrigerators and microwaves and drive to stores. We've outsourced our survival to systems we don't control and don't understand. And most of us have no idea how vulnerable that makes us. But here's what gives me hope. This knowledge isn't gone, it's just dormant. The techniques still work. The foods still last. The principles are still sound. We can relearn what was forgotten. We can rebuild household resilience even while living in a modern world. I started small in my own home. I bought wheat berries and learned to use a grain mill. I began keeping dried beans and rice in proper storage containers. I made my first batch of sauerkraut. I dried herbs and vegetables. I cured my first piece of bacon. None of it was complicated. It just required deciding to do it. Each small step reduced my dependency just a little. Each new skill made my household slightly more resilient. I wasn't trying to become completely self-sufficient or abandon modern conveniences. I was simply rebuilding a safety margin that my ancestors would have considered basic common sense. The real emergency foods were never on display in stores with bright packaging and marketing budgets. They were sitting in pantries, root cellars, and smokehouses, quietly doing their job year after year. They represented a different relationship with food, one based on preparation and knowledge rather than constant consumption and replacement. Supermarkets don't want you to think about foods that last decades because their business model depends on you buying constantly, throwing away regularly, and returning frequently. They profit from turnover, from obsolescence, from your dependence on their supply chain. But you don't have to accept that model completely. You can keep shopping at stores while also building a foundation of truly resilient foods at home. You can enjoy fresh produce while also knowing you have backup stores that won't fail you if systems falter. What I learned through all this research and experimentation is that real food security is knowledge-based, not purchase-based. It's not about how much you can buy. It's about what you know how to preserve, store, and use. It's about understanding that the most reliable foods are often the simplest, the oldest, the least marketed. When I look at my pantry now, I see it differently. Yes, there's fresh food and modern convenience items. But there's also grain that will outlast my car, beans that could feed my family for months, preserved foods that ask nothing but to be left alone until needed. That shift in perspective is powerful. It's the difference between being a consumer and being prepared, between dependency and resilience, between hoping systems keep working and knowing you'll be okay even if they don't. The emergency foods supermarkets don't want you to know about aren't exotic or expensive. They're simple, traditional staples that have sustained humans through every crisis and hardship we've ever faced. They're still here, still available, still effective. We just have to remember they exist and decide to use them. If this perspective resonated with you, if you're starting to see food security differently, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. We're building a community of people reclaiming practical knowledge and household resilience. We're learning together how to be less dependent and more capable. This journey doesn't end here, it's just beginning. Subscribe and be part of rediscovering what really keeps people safe when systems fail. The knowledge is out there, waiting to be remembered. Let's remember it together.